Your window comes down, the flashlight hits your face, and somewhere in the back of your mind a single question starts pounding. What do I actually have to do right now? Not what you think you should do, not what feels polite. What the law actually requires of you in this exact moment, standing here, engine running, heart going a little too fast for a Tuesday night. Here's the truth almost nobody tells you plainly. Out of everything that happens during a police encounter, the questions, the requests, the pressure, the silence that stretches out just a little too long, there is exactly one thing the law says you must do. 1. Not 10, not the 12 things officers imply you have to do through tone and posture and training. One real legal obligation, and everything else is negotiable, refusable, or simply none of their business. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what that one thing is, why it's the only thing, and then I'm going to arm you with the precise words to use for every single other moment of that encounter. Because knowing the one true rule means nothing if you don't know how to handle the 60 seconds of pressure surrounding it. Quick thing before we start, because a channel like this only works if people actually see it. If you're the kind of person who likes knowing exactly where you stand instead of guessing, hit subscribe right now before you get pulled into the rest of this, because there is a lot to cover, and you don't want to miss the follow-up on what happens after the stop when the officer starts building his report. This is legal education, not legal advice, for your specific situation. Your state may vary the details, but the bones of what I'm about to walk you through apply almost everywhere in this country. Let's get into it. So let's start with the one true obligation, because everything else in this video hangs off of it. When you are lawfully detained, meaning an officer has stopped you with actual legal justification, not just a hunch, the one thing the law requires of you is to identify yourself. That's it. That's the whole mandatory list. In the driving context specifically, that identification requirement expands slightly to include producing your license, your registration, and your proof of insurance, because those are the conditions attached to the privilege of operating a vehicle on public roads. Hand them over when asked. Do it calmly, do it with your hands visible, announce what you're doing before you reach for anything. That's the deal you made with the state the day you got your license, and there's no getting around it, and frankly you shouldn't want to, because refusing to identify yourself during a lawful stop doesn't protect you. It just turns a 2-minute stop into an arrest for obstruction. So that's rule number 1, the real one. The one carved in actual law. Identify yourself. Hand over your documents. Full stop. Now here's the part that changes everything. The part almost nobody explains clearly enough, and it's the reason this video exists. Once you've handed over your ID, your license, your registration, your insurance, you have satisfied your entire legal obligation. Everything that happens after that point is the officer asking you to volunteer more, not demanding under law, asking. And there is an enormous, almost invisible line between what an officer can lawfully order you to do with your body and what an officer can only ask you to give up with your mouth. The first category, physical compliance, you follow every time, without hesitation, because refusing a lawful physical order gets you hurt or arrested and wins you nothing. The second category, verbal or consent-based cooperation, is entirely yours to control, and this is where good, honest, law-abiding people give away rights they didn't even know they had, one polite answer at a time. So let's build the map. I'm going to walk you through every single phase of a typical stop, tell you exactly what's mandatory and what's optional, and give you the calm, simple words to use at each stage so you never have to think on your feet. Because thinking on your feet is exactly what the pressure of a stop is designed to prevent. Phase 1. The approach. The officer walks up, taps his flashlight on your window, maybe knocks twice out of habit even though your window's already going down. Roll it down enough to hand documents through, you don't have to roll it flat, and keep your hands on the wheel where they're visible until he asks for your paperwork. This is not the moment for chit-chat, and it's not the moment for hostility either. It's the moment for calm, neutral, boring cooperation. He says, "Good evening, how are we doing tonight?" You say, "Fine, officer, thank you." That's all that sentence needs. You are not required to explain your evening, your destination, your relationship status, or your opinions about the weather. A short, warm, forgettable answer is the correct answer every single time, because forgettable is safe and detailed is dangerous. The officer's training tells him, relaxed people talk, and talking people give him material. Don't hand him material, hand him documents. Phase 2. The document request. License, registration, insurance. This is the mandatory piece we already covered. Reach slowly. Narrate the reach. My registration's in the glove box. I'm going to open it now. And hand everything over with steady hands. This single habit, narrating your movements before you make them, does more to keep a stop calm and short than almost anything else you can do, because it removes the one thing that actually escalates encounters, which is surprise. Officers are trained to react to sudden movement. Remove the sudden movement and you remove 90% of the danger in the entire interaction. Phase 3, and this is where it starts to get interesting, because this is where the officer transitions from gathering what he's required to have to fishing for what he'd like to have. Do you know why I stopped you tonight? Sounds like small talk. It is not small talk. It's an invitation to confess, phrased as a casual question, and it works on decent people constantly, because decent people don't like lying and don't like awkward silence, so they fill the gap with a guess. I think I might have been going a little over. And just like that, an admission exists that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier, in your own voice, easy to write into a report, easy to use later. You are under no obligation to guess. None. The correct response is simple, and it never changes. I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop? Said plainly. No attitude, no defensiveness. You've answered honestly, because you genuinely don't know which of several possible reasons brought him to your window, and you've put the burden of stating a reason back where it legally belongs. On him, not you. Phase 4. The travel questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Whose car is this? Who's that in the passenger seat? This feels like conversation. It is data collection. Every detail you offer becomes a thread he can pull on later, and if your story doesn't match your passenger's story down to the smallest detail, you've just handed him the exact phrase that shows up in report after report across this entire country. Inconsistent statements. You are not required to narrate your evening. You've already given him the two things the law requires: your identity and your documents. The travel questions live entirely in the optional zone, and here's the sentence that closes that zone politely and permanently. I'd rather not get into that, officer. Am I free to go? Not rude, not combative, just a clean, respectful line in the sand. Now let's talk about Phase 5, because this is the moment the entire video has been building toward. The moment where the gap between what's mandatory and what's optional becomes the difference between going home and spending a night somewhere you never expected to be. The officer leans in slightly, lowers his voice just a touch, and says something like, "You don't mind if I take a quick look through the car, do you? I need you to sit with this for a second, because this is the single most consequential request in the entire encounter, and almost nobody is prepared for it." Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer generally needs one of three things to search your vehicle: a warrant, probable cause, or your consent. That third one, consent, is the only one that requires nothing from him at all except your agreement. And the moment you give it, every protection the other two categories would have provided you simply disappears. You handed him the key voluntarily. He didn't need probable cause anymore, because you gave him permission, and permission beats probable cause every time in the eyes of the law. Here's what should genuinely bother you about this. The officer has no legal obligation to inform you that you have the right to say no. He can ask the question while knowing full well that refusal is completely within your rights, and he is under no duty whatsoever to mention that fact. Courts have upheld this repeatedly. The request can be phrased in a way that feels like there's no real choice, when in fact you have every choice in the world. And this is exactly where innocent people get hurt, because the instinct of a law-abiding person is, I have nothing to hide, so why would I say no? Saying no makes me look guilty. That instinct, decent, honest, completely understandable, is precisely the vulnerability this request is designed to exploit. People consent to searches of cars they haven't cleaned out in months, cars a friend borrowed last weekend, cars with a passenger's forgotten belongings tucked under a seat, and an entirely innocent evening turns into a night that changes everything, all because of one polite, "Sure, go ahead." So here is the sentence. Say it out loud right now if you're somewhere you can. Officer, I don't consent to any searches. That's the whole sentence. No justification attached. No because I know my rights. No apology in your tone. Justifying it invites debate. Just state it, calmly, once, and let it stand. If he pushes back, and sometimes he will, with something like, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you don't take the bait, you don't get defensive. You simply repeat the same calm line. I understand, officer, but I still don't consent to any searches. If he says he'll call for a canine unit, you let him, and your answer doesn't change. Because refusing consent is not obstruction, it is not suspicious, and it is not an admission of anything. It is a citizen exercising a right the founders thought was important enough to write directly into the Constitution. Phase 6. Step out of the vehicle. A lot of people freeze here, wondering whether they even have to comply, whether refusing is somehow standing up for themselves. Here's the honest answer, because the honest answer keeps you safe. Yes, during a lawful stop, an officer can order you out of the car, and this power has been upheld by the Supreme Court going back decades, extending not just to drivers, but to passengers as well. This is not the hill to defend on the roadside. You comply, calmly, slowly, hands visible the entire time. But, and this is the part almost everyone misses, stepping out of your vehicle is not consent to anything. It is not consent to a search. It is not consent to further questioning. It is simply compliance with a lawful physical order. Your body follows the order. Your mouth still says nothing extra. If the questioning resumes once you're on the pavement, you go right back to your line. I'd rather not get into that. Am I free to go? And if a pat-down begins, know the boundary. An officer can generally check the outside of your clothing for weapons if he has a specific, articulable reason to believe you're armed, not simply a hunch, and not as a pretext to search for evidence of something else. You don't physically resist, but you can say clearly, for the record, I don't consent to this search. Phase 7. The wait. He walks back to his cruiser with your documents, and you sit there. 5 minutes, 10, 15, and you start to wonder what could possibly be taking this long for what should be a routine check. What's actually happening, more often than people realize, is that the clock is being stretched deliberately, extra checks being run, backup being called, sometimes a canine unit being requested to arrive before the stop officially concludes. Here's the rule that protects you, and it's one of the more important ones in this entire video. An officer cannot extend a traffic stop beyond the amount of time reasonably necessary to address the actual reason for the stop, unless he develops separate, independent, reasonable suspicion of another crime along the way. The stop has a defined purpose, and once that purpose is resolved, the legal justification for holding you resolves with it. He can't just keep you there indefinitely, fishing, hoping something turns up if he waits long enough. So how do you use that knowledge without starting an argument you'll never win on the side of the road? You ask, calmly and once, the 4 words that do more legal work than almost anything else you can say. Am I free to go? That question forces a binary outcome. Either he says yes, and you leave, or he has to acknowledge that you are being detained, which starts a clock that now runs against him, not you, because every extra minute without proper justification becomes a problem for his case later, not for yours. Ask it politely. Ask it once. If the answer is that you're being detained, you go quiet. You wait it out without escalating, and you save every argument for the place. Arguments actually get decided. A courtroom, not a roadside. Now, one crucial warning that ties this whole framework together, because silence alone is not automatically the shield people assume it is. There's an important legal wrinkle here. Simply going quiet, without ever clearly stating that you are invoking your right to remain silent, does not always guarantee that your silence can't be used against you later. Courts have wrestled with this exact question, and the safer, cleaner approach is to say it out loud. Not just stop talking and hope the silence speaks for itself, actually state the words, "Officer, I am choosing to remain silent, and I do not consent to any searches." Then stop talking. That sentence is your shield, and it only works fully if you actually raise it out loud, instead of just hoping your silence gets interpreted correctly. Let's step back now, because everything so far has centered on the classic traffic stop, but the same one mandatory thing, everything else optional framework applies across nearly every kind of police encounter you might face, and I want to walk through those too, because the rules shift just enough between contexts that people get tripped up if they assume one situation works exactly like another. Let's talk about the pedestrian stop, the sidewalk version of this entire dynamic. An officer approaches you walking down the street. There are really 2 categories this can fall into, and the difference between them changes everything about what you're required to do. The first is a purely consensual encounter, an officer walking up and starting a conversation with no legal basis to detain you at all. In that situation, you are not required to answer a single question, not even to identify yourself, and you are free to simply walk away, calmly, without running, without arguing. The second is what's often called an investigative stop, sometimes referred to by the case that first defined it, where an officer has a specific, articulable, reasonable suspicion that you're involved in criminal activity. In that scenario, depending on your state, you may be required to identify yourself, because a number of states have what are called stop and identify statutes. The catch, and it's an important one, is that you're generally entitled to know whether you're being detained or whether you're free to leave. And asking that question directly, am I being detained or am I free to go, is the cleanest way to figure out which category you're actually in. Because the honest truth is, you often can't tell just by the tone of the conversation. Officers are trained to keep that line blurry on purpose, because a blurry line makes people cooperate further than they're legally required to. Now let's talk about something people almost never think through in advance. What happens when officers show up at your front door? This one matters because your home carries the strongest protections in the entire framework of American law. Stronger than your car, stronger than the sidewalk, and the rules shift accordingly. If officers knock on your door without a warrant, you are under no obligation to open it. None. You can speak through the door, you can speak through a window, you can simply not answer at all, and none of that constitutes obstruction or suspicious behavior. If you do choose to open the door partially or step outside to talk, understand that stepping outside can sometimes change the legal analysis of what happens next. So if you want the strongest possible protection, you keep the door closed or open it only a crack, and you ask one simple question before anything else. Do you have a warrant? If the answer is no, you are not required to let them in, and you are not required to answer questions through the door either. If the answer is yes, ask to see it, because a valid search warrant should specify exactly what can be searched and where, and officers exceeding those specific boundaries are exceeding their legal authority, not exercising it. Let's talk about being pulled over specifically for a suspected DUI, because this scenario carries its own layer of nuance on top of everything we've already covered. The one mandatory piece remains the same. Identify yourself, hand over your documents. But field sobriety tests, the walk and turn, the one-leg stand, following a pen with your eyes, these are, in most places, voluntary. You can decline them. Now here's the honest trade-off you need to understand, because I'm not going to pretend there isn't one. Declining doesn't make the stop disappear, and an officer who already suspects impairment can often still arrest you based on other observations, the smell, your speech, your driving pattern, and request a chemical test at the station or roadside depending on your jurisdiction. That chemical test, a breath, blood, or urine test after a lawful arrest, often falls under what's called implied consent law, meaning that by holding a driver's license in that state, you've already agreed in advance to submit to it if lawfully arrested for suspected impairment. And refusing that specific chemical test frequently carries automatic penalties, like an immediate license suspension, separate entirely from whatever happens with the underlying DUI charge. This is genuinely one of the more complicated corners of traffic law. It varies significantly state to state, and if you find yourself in that exact situation, get a lawyer involved as early as humanly possible, because the stakes and the technical rules shift so much by jurisdiction that a general video like this one can only get you the framework, not the final answer. Let's talk about passengers for a moment, because passengers often assume they have fewer rights than the driver, when in some ways their position is actually stronger. A passenger is not the one who agreed to the conditions of a driver's license, and a passenger has not been legally required to identify themselves in many states unless there's independent reasonable suspicion connecting that specific passenger to criminal activity. That said, if an officer orders a passenger out of the vehicle, the same rule applies as it does for the driver. Comply physically with the lawful order, and keep your mouth closed on anything beyond identification if it's actually required in your state. Passengers can decline to answer questions about where the group is coming from or going, exactly the same way a driver can, and a passenger declining a search request for their own bag or belongings carries the exact same weight as a driver declining consent for the vehicle. Now let's talk about something that comes up constantly and causes a huge amount of unnecessary fear: recording the police. In the overwhelming majority of the country, you have a clearly established right to record police officers performing their public duties in public, as long as you're not physically interfering with the stop itself. Officers sometimes tell people to stop recording, sometimes threaten to confiscate a phone, sometimes claim it's illegal. None of that changes the underlying law in most jurisdictions. If you want to record a stop involving you or someone else, position your phone somewhere stable. State calmly that you're recording for your own records, and continue complying physically with every lawful instruction while the camera runs. Recording is not obstruction. Recording is not resisting. Recording is simply documentation, and documentation has protected more innocent people than almost any single legal strategy on this list. Let's talk about the arrest itself, because everything shifts the moment those handcuffs go on. Once you are formally in custody and an officer begins asking you questions specifically designed to elicit incriminating information, you're entitled to be informed of certain rights before that custodial interrogation continues. The right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the warning that anything you say can be used against you. This is the warning most people have heard referenced their whole lives without fully understanding when it actually applies. It applies specifically to custodial interrogation, meaning you're in custody and being questioned. It does not apply to the earlier roadside conversation, which is exactly why everything we covered in the earlier phases matters so much, because officers are allowed to ask you a tremendous amount before you're ever arrested, and nothing before that point requires them to warn you of anything at all. If you are arrested and those rights are read to you, the correct move is simple. State clearly that you are invoking your right to remain silent and that you want an attorney, and then stop talking entirely, even if the questions continue. Even if there are long silences that feel unbearably awkward, even if an officer implies that cooperating now will go easier for you later. It rarely does, and even when it might, that's a conversation for your attorney to have on your behalf, not one to have alone in the back of a patrol car with nobody there to advise you. Let's circle back and tie all of this together, because I don't want you walking away from this video with a dozen scattered rules. I want you walking away with one framework you can apply to literally any encounter you ever have with law enforcement for the rest of your life. Here it is, distilled all the way down. There is exactly one mandatory action. Identify yourself, and in a vehicle, produce your license, registration, and insurance when lawfully asked. Everything else in every encounter breaks into exactly two categories: physical orders, which you obey immediately and without argument, because that's what keeps you safe and unharmed, and verbal or consent-based requests, which are entirely optional and which you decline calmly, politely, and without justification, every single time, regardless of how innocent you are, regardless of how uncomfortable the silence feels, regardless of how friendly the officer seems. Comply with your hands. Decline with your words. Save every argument for court, because the roadside was never designed to be a place where you win, and it isn't designed to be a place where you lose either. It's simply not the venue. The venue is later, with an attorney, in a room where the pressure of a badge and a flashlight and a ticking clock isn't sitting 3 feet from your face. I want to give you the exact phrases one more time, back to back, so they're fresh in your mind and easy to recall if you're ever standing in that moment for real. When asked if you know why you were stopped, "I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop?" When the travel questions start, "I'd rather not get into that. Am I free to go?" When consent to search is requested, the single most important sentence in this entire video: "Officer, I don't consent to any searches." When you're being held longer than feels reasonable, "Am I free to go?" And if things escalate toward custody and silence, "I am choosing to remain silent, and I do not consent to any searches." 5 sentences. Calm, short, unshakable. Practice saying them out loud right now, in your own voice, in your own kitchen, so they're not foreign to you the first time you actually need them, because the entire danger of a police stop isn't the law itself. The law, when you know it, is actually on your side more often than people assume. The danger is the 20 seconds of pressure, where you don't know what to say, and pressure without preparation is exactly when good people talk themselves into trouble they never should have been anywhere near. One more thing before we close this out, because it matters just as much as anything else in this video. Everything I've walked you through here is about staying calm and staying safe in the moment, and none of it is about being combative, disrespectful, or difficult with an officer on the roadside. You can assert every single one of these rights while remaining completely polite, completely respectful, completely cooperative with your body the entire time. Asserting your rights and being respectful are not opposites. They work together, and in practice, officers respond far better to someone who is calm, clear, and firm than to someone who is either silent and hostile or chatty and evasive. The version of you that gets through a stop the fastest and the safest is the version that says, "Yes, sir, no, sir," hands over documents smoothly, and then simply, calmly declines the things that aren't required, without ever raising a voice or making a scene. That's not weakness. That's the smartest, most controlled way to handle 60 seconds that were never designed to be fair in the first place. If this video gave you even one sentence you didn't already have memorized before you clicked play, do one simple thing for me. Hit subscribe, because there's more of this coming, breaking down the exact wording for encounters most people never even think to prepare for, the ones that catch good, honest people completely off guard, because nobody ever sat them down and explained the difference between what the law demands and what an officer merely hopes you'll hand over out of politeness. Stay calm out there, know the one thing you actually owe, and keep everything else exactly where it belongs, in your own hands, under your own control.